Okay, you were asked to think of interventions in all of these domains, and I'm sure that you were able to come up with more in some areas and fewer in others. And you may have come across many that at first you thought there weren't any for, and then if you thought about your own personal experience, you might be surprised how many interventions there are. Now, even though the list starts with medical, we're going to start with behavioral because often first semester students are a bit nervous about this one. They're not as tuned into this as people who've been here for a semester. So I have four things to say about that. First, remember that you'll be working in groups with a person who has that expertise. Second, we're about to go into them in the lecture, and I'll also put up some additional readings or tell you where you can read more about it. Third, remember we don't need to go into it in great detail. And fourth, you can always call me or write me if you have any questions about those. So let's just look for a moment at some of the behavioral interventions. And these are not sort of regular routine things for many of us. So there is a degree of technical knowledge here. So when we talk about behavioral techniques, we can talk about behavioral techniques that are motivational as well as those that are about dealing with fear. Usually we have things in those two categories, as well as now cognitive behavioral therapies, which we'll get into in a moment as well. So I'm going to break down all the things on this list in subsequent slides. So we're going to talk about reinforcement, successive approximation, extinction, satiation, intrinsic and extrinsic reinforcement, vicarious reinforcement, intermittent reinforcement, natural and logical consequences, and redirection. And in fact, we'll talk about a couple others that aren't in this list. So reinforcement is probably the most important behavioral tool. And we talk about reinforcement in a variety of different ways, but probably the most important is talking about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So here are some really important things you need to understand. When we talk about reinforcement, reinforcement is always something that is desirable to the person who's experiencing it. And that will become important later on as I try to clarify a common confusion that happens. So desirable, or another way of putting it is, you want reinforcement in your life. Everybody does, and any reinforcement automatically means it's something you want. So what we mean by the idea of reinforcement is the same thing we might mean if we said we were reinforcing a part of our house or a bridge. We're talking about strengthening something. So reinforcement strengthens the behavior we want to see. Reinforcement is a proactive strategy. We use it to gradually create a desired behavior or to increase the amount of a desired behavior. There are lots of different types of it, and there are lots of ways to deliver it. And if you read your competencies, your blue-green book, chapters 8 and 9, particularly chapter 9, explores much of what we're talking about here in more detail. Now we're going to talk about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement specifically. R+, which is the abbreviation for positive reinforcement, is simply defined as a desired response is given after a behavior to strengthen the behavior. An example of that would be your paycheck. Your boss gives you your paycheck at the end of your work week as a way of saying, we want you to keep working, and it works. The more that they keep doing that, the more that you keep coming back. So they've added something, and that is the key idea. The word positive does not mean nice or pleasant or enthusiastic. It means added. So positive reinforcement is a desired response is added or is given after a behavior to strengthen the behavior. Negative reinforcement is also a desirable thing. Say that with me. You want negative reinforcement in your life. Negative reinforcement happens when an undesired thing is avoided, removed, or, forgive the typo, reduced after a behavior, and it also strengthens the behavior. So a couple of examples. When you take your garbage out to the side of the road on garbage day, your behavior of taking it out is reinforced by somebody getting rid of, they are removing your stinky, rotten garbage. When you use the behavior of taking a Tylenol because you have a headache and it takes away the headache, that's another example of negative reinforcement. It is subtracting. So the negative refers to the minus, and that's why that abbreviation is R minus. It's taking away something you don't want. In some cases, if we're really lucky, we use a behavior that does both of these things at the same time. So for example, let's say we are bored. So we go out and we do something like a craft that we can sell. When we do this craft, we remove our boredom, and we also have something that will make money. So we're getting something we don't want removed, boredom, and we're getting something that we do want added, money. So if we're really lucky, we use behaviors that can have both of these things. Now, it's very common for people to get negative reinforcement and punishment confused. And I really want to stress that they are not the same thing. Let me tell you a story that will give you an example of this. Marcia's mother expects her to clean her room every Saturday afternoon. But when Marcia's mother sees that Marcia did not clean the room, she yells at Marcia. Yelling at Marcia is a punishment. The next week, Marcia remembers being yelled at, and she does not want to experience that again. So she cleans her room. By cleaning her room, she is negatively reinforced in the second week because she avoided or removed the yelling by doing that. You might also argue she removed the messiness. Okay, so don't confuse the two things. When a person is punished or consequated, that is because we are hoping the next time they will try to get negatively reinforced. They'll try to remove or avoid it. You'll also hear the term successive approximation, which is just a way of delivering reinforcement, usually positive reinforcement, and it just means that we're giving reinforcement along the way as a person is, particularly as they're learning a new skill or getting better at something, and any progress that they make receives reinforcement, receives some kind of reward. And it's as opposed to doing that only at the end of them making that progress. For example, if your child is trying to learn to tie their shoes, you probably give them praise and rewards for them getting their shoes, putting their shoes in the correct feet, holding the ends of the shoelaces correctly, or correctly tying the first loop. You wouldn't wait until the child got all of the steps done before you gave them a positive reinforcement, because they would probably give up and they wouldn't actually ever accomplish it. So successive approximation just means giving reinforcement, usually positive, as any progress is made along the way. You can learn more about reinforcement, and you'll find this all in Chapter 9, page 178 to 187 in your greenish-blue book. And it talks about intrinsic and extrinsic reinforcement. Now, these can still be positive and negative. People often get confused about the idea, well, does positive fit into one of these categories or negative? And the answer is no. You can have any combination of positive and negative, intrinsic and extrinsic, and the next thing we're going to talk about, primary and secondary. So intrinsic reinforcers are simply the reinforcements that we feel inside of us. They're often hidden to other people. And they're sort of the real reason we do something. For example, Marcia was getting an intrinsic reinforcement of the feeling of a neat room and the removed stress of a messy room in the last example. For you, an example might be the way that studying makes you feel. It might give you a positive intrinsic reinforcer. I'm proud of myself for studying. And a negative intrinsic reinforcer. I feel less stressed. I've removed some stress. And those are things inside of you. Extrinsic reinforcers are extra, and they're externals. And we usually add them, especially at the beginning of some programming, as a way of pumping up the volume, I guess you could say, creating a bonus system so that people are more likely to do whatever it is we're trying to reinforce. And a good example of this is what Subway used to do when it was first on the scene, and they actually did it for a number of years, where they gave people a sticker every time they came in and bought a 6-inch sandwich. If you bought a 12-inch sandwich, you got 2 stickers, and every 6 stickers you would get a 6-inch free sandwich. So that was an extra. The main reason people went in there was for the sandwich and to to deal with the feeling of hunger and the feeling of pleasure that they had. Those were intrinsic reinforcers. But Subway really wanted to make you come in, so they added this extra external reinforcer. You could literally see them giving the stickers to people. They don't do it anymore, but you can think of other examples, I'm sure. Like, for example, McDonald's has a program for the coffee cups, or when you hear about Goodyear tires giving you a free tire when you buy 3, those are examples. There's also primary and secondary reinforcement. Primary reinforcement is reinforcement that you do not need to learn. You are literally born valuing these things. Even a baby would like them. They're very simple, and therefore they communicate very well to people who are cognitively impaired or limited in some way. They include things like food, water, sleep, physical pleasure. Think about, for example, the feeling of having your shoulders rubbed. For most people, that is just primarily reinforcing. And companionship, be it the company of another person or of having your dog sit on your lap. These don't need to be taught to us normally. But a lot of the things that we need to do when we are older require us to have a stronger cognitive ability. They're what we call secondary reinforcers. We have to learn about them. For example, a paycheck doesn't mean anything to a person if they don't understand it as a symbol. So these are more complex, and often when we're trying to teach things to people who have cognitive difficulties, who can't understand abstractions, we need to find a way to simplify the reinforcer. So there are usually 4 examples of these: tokens, which are also called symbols, such as an A on your report. That A is a complete symbol. Money is a symbol. We don't actually, if you take that same money and you go and you try to use it in India, it might not have any value there because that symbol is not valued. Activities, such as telling somebody that when they're finished doing a chore, they can play a video game. Material items, such as telling somebody that if they do something for you, you'll give them a new set of earbuds, for example. That doesn't seem like a terribly sophisticated thing to learn, but you have to be more advanced, at least to some extent. And social cues, such as high fives or pats on the back, or even compliments like praise. Those are things that we have to learn. So we'll often couple with primary and secondary so that a person who doesn't understand the really complex things will get something. So you'll literally see little children who are getting high fives from their applied behavioral analyst when they're doing some behavioral therapy, and at the same time they'll get a little tiny piece of M&M so that they are literally seeing both the primary and the secondary at the same time. The next one is called vicarious reinforcement. And vicarious reinforcement is a technique that you can use both proactively and reactively. On this slide, I'll talk about it proactively. All it simply means is that we are going to reward other people who are using the desired behavior when they are in the presence of the individual that is our subject. So for example, if I go into a school and I see a child who is not putting his hand up and he's getting out of his seat, the teacher will sometimes say to me, well, I can't give Johnny a reward for putting his hand up when I don't give one to Susie and Mike and Steve. And I say, no, in fact, the opposite is true. You should give it to Susie and Mike and Steve every time they put their hands up. And then Johnny will start to notice that pattern and he will want to get rewarded as well. So vicarious reinforcement works really well with people who aren't doing something a lot at the beginning, and then they'll see other people who are using that behavior get that reward and they'll want it too. The PREMAC principle is what I'm going to get you to do some reading about, and it's on page, let's see here, page 183 of your book. But in a nutshell, the PREMAC principle simply says we're more likely to do something we don't like our homework or a chore, if it is followed by a more preferred activity, such as a video game or having a snack. And this is especially true if it's contingent, meaning if we only get to do the preferred activity because we did the primary activity or the first activity, then we're more likely to do it. Or another way of putting it, even better in my view, is the faster that a person or the better that a person does the less preferred activity, like cleaning the room or studying their spelling, the faster or better the second activity will be. So read up on the Premack principle. And intermittent reinforcement is a system of simply giving people a reward some of the time when they do the desired behavior instead of all of the time. And the reason why is going to be explored more in a slide in a moment. But here's the bottom line. People will get tired of the reward. It'll be less effective if we don't give it more infrequently. And that's a strange phenomenon, but if you think about the way that slot machines work, you can see that it can be very powerful for people to get a reward only some of the time. If you read on page 185 and 186, you can see that it gets into a little bit more detail about fixed and variable schedules and about ratios versus interval systems or time-based systems. So read up on those things. Okay, let's talk now about some reactive behavioral tools. And a reminder that reactive strategies are strategies we use when the person uses the undesired or troublesome behavior, and it's our way of responding so that we minimize any problems or damage from that behavior, try to kind of bring it back down to normal as soon as possible. As well, it's helpful to try and find things that are going to be constructive or are going to help our proactive strategy. At the very least, we don't want to do something reactively that confuses or frustrates our proactive strategy. So the first of these is called extinction. Extinction means that we're really just removing the reinforcer. And sometimes you'll hear people talk about extinguishing, and it's really the exact same thing. And if you think about extinguishing a fire, it kind of works the same way. If I take away one of the ingredients, like oxygen in a fire, then the fire won't continue. And extinction can be done in two ways. One of them is not reactive. It's a preventative strategy, and it's called stimulus control. And I spoke about it in the first video. An example would be people going into a recovery home, having themselves trucked or any visitors checked for drugs, because drugs in that workplace would be really just an unnecessary temptation to people. And so the idea is to try and manage any potential harms. But you can also see why if we completely took people away from drugs throughout their therapy, they would never ever get good at being resilient when they're back exposed to them. So it's not a strategy we want to do in the long term. Extinction as a reactive strategy is sometimes called a response cost, or some strange reason sometimes those words are reversed in its cost response. Or extinguishing. It simply means that we remove the reinforcer when the person's behavior starts to occur. In the first video, I used the example of a program where we created an off-the-table response. As soon as an individual began to behave in a really perseverant way, became loud and started tapping everybody on the shoulders, we used this term off the table to tell staff, remove attention. That was called an extinction of attention. And sometimes people make the mistake of thinking it's called ignoring, but it's not ignoring because we're just responding to that behavior. As soon as the person's behavior changed, our response to him changed. So we weren't ignoring him. We were simply literally turning our backs or even walking away or even giving attention to other people in a very physical way as soon as that behavior occurred. Similarly, if a person starts taking food with their fingers from the plates in the middle of the table, and you remove that food from their reach, that would be an example of extinguishing. It doesn't work for every person. Some people would get up and start chasing after that food or get more escalated in trying to reach the person who is removing attention. Another one is called satiation, and that just basically means letting the person get their fill. If you're satiated, you're full, you got enough, you're satisfied. And in my experience, it's not always a useful strategy. I can tell you one example where it was, and it's kind of an adult scenario, where an individual who was not well versed in how to self-stimulate from a sexual standpoint was really helped to learn how to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a life skills teaching part of this course. But really what happened is that he was given an opportunity to go and have time by himself and meet that need, and therefore he would be less likely to do it in a public place. Another example, some other examples, and these have limited use, are when you hear people say, well, I let my kids eat all their Halloween candy until they're sick of it, and then they won't want to eat so much next time. Pretty risky, as you can tell. A lot of kids don't ever seem to get tired of their candy. Or listening to a song until the person gets sick of it. The problem with that is that everybody else might have to listen to that song to the point where they're ready to jump off a bridge before the individual you're supporting gets tired of it. We talked about vicarious reinforcement as another strategy. We talked about it as a way of proactive behaviorally reinforcing somebody, but it can also be used reactively. And I'll give you an example of this. Imagine that an individual is misbehaving in the presence of others who are doing our desired or prosocial behavior, and we turn to the people who are doing the behavior we want, and we give them a reward. And that often is a way of showing a person in the moment that their behavior is not desired and shaping it so that they can see a more desired behavior. A classic example I like to tell is the story of somebody coming home with groceries, asking their children to help. One child consistently says no, and that child says no this time as well and starts playing with video games. The other child, who is usually helpful, goes out and helps with the groceries. And when the mom finishes with the groceries, she reaches into the freezer and gives the child who helped a popsicle. And the other child sees the child with the popsicle and says, I want one, I want one. And mom says, well, next time if you help with putting away the groceries, you'll get one too. That's an example of vicarious reinforcement. And I might add, it's also an example of something called an educational correction. Educational corrections aren't listed on this particular slide, but they're a valuable tool because they simply say to people, next time, if you do this desired behavior, you'll get this positive reinforcement or desired outcome. So educational corrections, even though they aren't on your slide, are well worth noting. Natural and logical consequences are also examples of reactive behavioral tools. We already talked about them in a previous video. Natural consequences occur due to nature, but they can be sometimes severe or unpredictable. Normally, they are okay to use from an ethical standpoint as long as you are making sure they're not too severe and as long as you can be confident to some extent that they will actually occur. Remember, though, we're focused on the proactive positive strategies, so these are not something we always do. And an example of a natural consequence is if you left your homework to the last minute, you would naturally feel the stress of having that happen. You would naturally see that everything became more difficult. You would naturally see that your mark would probably be lower. Nobody would have to know that you left it till late and do something to you. It would just happen because of that. Logical consequences are put in place by another person, but they're based on reason, not a power differential. They too can be severe sometimes, but if they're reasonably severe, for example, if I go out and I crash my wife's car and end up owing $20,000, that is severe, but it's also reasonable. And sometimes there are variations, more than one possible consequence. Three people might look at the same scenario and arrive at different logical consequences. For example, one person might say you have to pay for something to be fixed. Somebody else might say you're not allowed to borrow the thing you damaged again. And a third person might say you have to repair the thing that you broke. So any of those are examples of logical consequences. Redirection is another one, and it's a very common and important one, so it deserves its own slide. So redirection is a reactive strategy, and you've learned about it in other modules. And it's important for us to remember that it refers to the idea of directing a person's troublesome behavior toward a desired behavior, something that is engaging and desired for them, and that is alternative and acceptable to others. There are two choices. This is the first one is the functional alternative, which is a behavior that will meet the person's needs as well as or better than the troublesome behavior. So for example, if a person is screaming and yelling and you get that person to go into a quiet room and start using their sensory tools, they might dance or sing or rip up pieces of paper, Any of those might help them with that same function of ventilating. Incompatible alternatives are behaviors that simply can't be performed at the same time as the troublesome behavior. So an example would be a person who is yelling and screaming at a staff person going outside and shooting hoops. And if they're outside shooting basketball hoops, shooting the basketball, then they can't be inside yelling at a coworker, at a staff person. So it's incompatible. And in many cases, you can do both. And in both cases I just gave you, really you could see how if a person went to a separate space and then did this activity, it might help them with their both things. It might keep them away from the person they're targeting, as well as it might help them meet their needs. But those are just examples. Not everything is about ventilation. Sometimes it's about going and fixing a problem or meeting a physiological need, like getting a snack, for example. Another set of behavioral tools are used to address fear and nervousness and shyness and all of the feelings you might describe as discomfort. One of these tools is called exposure therapy, which is sometimes called systematic desensitization. Exposure therapy just really means that the person is very gradually and very systematically exposed to the thing that causes them fear. So I'll give you two examples. Let's pretend a person is afraid of heights. We wouldn't immediately take them out to the Lynn Canyon suspension bridge and have them walk into the middle of it. That would be something called flooding. And flooding is a very, very dangerous thing to do because it can cause trauma to people. It's considered ineffective and unethical. Instead, what we might do is have that person gradually start to experience something that is involving height in a small way. So for example, we might drive past the entrance to the Lynn Canyon Park multiple times and each time have the person describe how they felt internally and work through that. Then the next step might be that we pull in and stay in the car in the parking lot. After a period of time of the person feeling calm enough with that, we might get out of the car and stand in the parking lot. We might, after a period of time, walk to the edge of the parking lot and see the bridge. We might then go and stand at the foot of the bridge and so forth until gradually over a series of many weeks or even months, the person was able to venture out into the bridge. And I just used the example of a bridge. You could use a ladder. You could use just about anything. And I've seen people do it with dogs where we started off by having the person get a book about dogs that had pictures of dogs in cartoon form. So very sort of friendly and unintimidating images. Gradually they moved into seeing books that had real pictures of dogs, and then from there videos of dogs, and then from there going to the pet store and looking through the window at the puppies, and maybe going in and touching the puppies, and then going in and gradually seeing larger dogs at through windows or through screens at the pound, and very gradually over the course of time having that person develop a level of calmness, let's call it, at each of those gradations. So if you can see a comparison there to shaping, you're probably on the right track. That's basically what we're doing, only instead of shaping a new skill, we're really learning to keep our anxiety low as we're gradually exposed to this thing that causes discomfort. Another valuable tool is classical conditioning. And you can go back and you can find out about classical conditioning in ample spaces, on lots of places on the internet. And the famous example, of course, everybody knows about is Ivan Pavlov's experiment where he rang a bell while he fed a dog food. And of course the dog drooled whenever he put the food in front of it because the dog was conditioned to food. The dog knew what food was. The bell on its own didn't do anything to the dog initially. But because he rang the bell every single time, after a while, if he rang the bell and didn't give the food right away, the dog drooled anyways. And it happened at an unconscious level. We don't believe the dog needed to be very intellectually capable or cognitively capable. So one good thing about this is that if we can do this pairing, it works on just about anybody, even babies. I used this with my son when we went on a long road trip. He needed to sleep at some unusual times given the schedule of our road trip. And so initially when we were driving and he was falling asleep, I would play a particular song by Michael Bublé called You and I. And the song on its own had no effect on him, but every time he was getting sleepy, I would play this song. And by the time we finished this rather lengthy road trip over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, if I wanted him to sleep, I would play the music, and the music would cause him to get sleepy. So it now started to be a conditioned response. And we can use this to help people who are uneasy or afraid. So let me give you an example. Let's take the example of a piece of music again and pretend that we play this music in the background whenever a supported individual is doing something that's really calming and enjoyable for them, such as floating in their pool or having a nice hot bath or that sort of thing. And we want this individual to become comfortable with going in the car. We might start playing this music when they're riding in the car after we've essentially created this association or conditioning. We sort of load up the music with good feelings, and after a period of time, we can play it while they're in the car. And you could probably imagine how using exposure therapy and classical conditioning together would work well. And you're exactly right. If we wanted to take our friend out to Lynn Canyon Park and we had been using a piece of music that we had been conditioning to be around relaxing things, then we could bring that music the same way. Another tool that's really useful are the range of cognitive behavior therapies. Now, this is a classic example of a service that you would help a person to reach out and achieve, but you wouldn't be delivering the service specifically yourself. The programming would come from a qualified therapist. So we don't always do these things ourselves. There are many different ways that cognitive behavioral therapy is delivered. Those are called modalities. People can go to one-to-one counseling, can participate in group therapies. They can go and get books or videos and do self-help. They can take classroom courses. And the most common thing is to see a hybrid or combination of those things for that individual. And there are not only various ways to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, but there are different models. And probably the most popular right now is dialectic or dialectical behavior therapy called DBT. So DBT is a form of CBT. And dialectical behavior therapy works really well for people who not only have anxieties, but issues around really emotional management or emotional intelligence. People with, for example, personality disorders or anxiety disorders often use this as well. Even people who are going through drug and alcohol recovery. And it focuses on 4 tools, and it uses coursework and individual counseling and group counseling, and there are lots of tools out there. And it works for kids, teenagers, and adults. The first area is mindfulness, teaching people really to check in with themselves and to have a degree of intentionality as they're going through things particularly that are stressful for them. Distress tolerance is the next one, helping people to learn how much they can handle being in uncertain or uncomfortable circumstances, sort of leaning into things that make them feel anxious or uncomfortable. The third is developing a set of skills that are around interpersonal effectiveness, really thinking about how a person communicates and socializes in a way that makes people more likely to do what we want and to want to be with us rather than creating conflict. And the fourth is self-regulation, learning things that we can do both internally and externally that help us to kind of keep our emotions from being too extreme. And a lot of folks rely on other people or on substances to regulate their emotions. And so DBT can be helpful to help people learn how to do some of this stuff within oneself. But DBT is not the only tool. Reality therapy, which also has a large educational component, and there are tools out there that are one-to-one and self-help. And what it really focuses on is asking the person to think about what's working for them. To really, it's obviously got more to it than this, but really what I love about reality therapy is it asks the person to think about one simple question a lot. And that question is, how's that working for you? Really kind of stopping and thinking about the behaviors that deliver the most results for people. And what I really like using is that type of approach in combination with things like exposure therapy and even reinforcement. And we talked about vicarious reinforcement in an earlier example. And saying to people things like, hey, did you notice that your brother got the popsicle and you didn't? What do you think is working for you? What would you like to do next time? And having people not only experience it externally, but think about it internally. Another therapy is called RBT or REBT, and this is Albert Ellis's theory, rational emotive behavior therapy. And what he basically said is if we change the way we think or our perceptions of things, we'll often change the feelings we have, and therefore will change our behavior. And we do some work around RBT in a Ellis exercise, a personal growth exercise that we usually do in September. Some of you have experienced it, will remember that. Others will experience it then. The basic idea is that often when we dive into the thinking behind our behaviors, we arrive at a conclusion that things are not what we imagine. A classic example of this is public speaking. People are often highly avoidant of public speaking, and it's completely irrational because every time you're out in the community, you're doing public speaking. But it's something that we have to sometimes kind of get people to focus on and do exercises with, and that's what REBT does. It combines individual therapy, group therapy, and again, educational work. All of these things can be done together, and they can be combined with reinforcement. Imagine the power of rewarding people for doing their workbook or going to their group session or participating as a speaker at a 12-step program. All of these are examples of ways that we can work these tools together. They do not get used one or two at a time. We use as many of them at once as we can. All right, so we want to take just a moment to have you see if you can apply some of these. First, I'll get you to put your answers on the Facebook group. And again, you can work as an individual or you can work with others, and we'll see how that works. Then later on, we'll discuss some of these in a group chat, probably on Zoom. So Jim is going to be our case study. Let's pretend there are three major problems with Jim. The first one is that because he is afraid of traffic, and we're going to presume we've done some assessment and we know that that's the case, Jim is afraid of traffic. So as a result of that, he won't walk to his program or around his neighborhood. He tends to stay indoors, stay in his room all the time. He has a fear of anything that goes down the road, even though it is safe to walk in his area. A couple of other problems, Jim's hygiene is suffering, and in particular, he will not take a shower most days, and he will not brush his teeth most days, or doesn't. And that's often because he is downstairs in his room playing video games, and that seems to be a really big distraction for him. He's on the video games with his friends with a headset on and talking to them, and finds it very difficult to be motivated to leave that activity. And finally, he also eats in his room, again for the same reason. The video games are very motivating for him. So his room's getting very dirty, and there is a safety concern because mold is growing in the dishes that he leaves around his room and on the food scraps. So there are 4 questions I'd like you to try and answer. First, see if you can define the desired behaviors for Jim. Second, see if you can define the troublesome behaviors for Jim. And remember, behaviors are things that we can observe. They're not things that people think or feel, but they're specific, concrete, observable things. We can measure them, for example. And then finally, the last two questions, what tools do you think we might use to develop those desired behaviors for Jim? Those are called the proactive strategies. And what tools might we use to respond or react if he uses his troublesome behaviors? See if you can come up with some specific answers to these. Put them up on Facebook, and we'll talk about them later on. As always, if you have any questions, reach out to me, and I'll happily answer them for you. Thanks.